I remember that June afternoon like it was yesterday. I was halfway through the tomato row when a sharp pain ran from my lower back down to my left foot. I had to stop right there in the middle of peak harvest season. And when I looked at the garden, I saw something almost as frustrating as the pain itself. 15 wooden tomato stakes I had bought that spring for $45 had rotted and snapped after one thunderstorm. 3 seasons in a row, I had done the same thing: drive the stakes, tie the plants, bend over, kneel down, get back up, then spend the evening with an aching back and an ice pack. For years, I thought that was simply the price of having a productive garden. That afternoon, I seriously wondered if gardening had finally become something my body could no longer afford. But then I asked myself a strange question. Why does the forest never need me to stake its plants? Why does nature grow upward without asking me to kneel beside it? That question changed the way I garden, and the first change cost me $25. I replaced my rows of wooden stakes with a 16-foot cattle panel. You may know these as heavy welded wire panels used for livestock fencing. I bought one for about $25, bent it into a long arch, and secured it to 4 steel T-posts. That single change did something I hadn't expected. It moved the garden up to me. Instead of bending down to find tomatoes tangled against the soil, I could walk underneath the arch, stand upright, and reach the fruit at chest height. The first time I stood there, I remember stretching my arms out and realizing I could reach almost the entire trellis without kneeling. That felt like a completely different kind of gardening. Not easier because I was doing less gardening. Easier because the garden was finally working with my body instead of against. I planted brandywine, Cherokee purple, and sun gold beneath the arch. Instead of tying every stem tightly to a separate stake, I gently guided the branches through the openings in the panel. As the season progressed, the plants climbed over the steel frame and filled the arch with leaves and fruit. By harvest time, I could simply walk underneath, stand straight, and pick a ripe tomato. No pounding stakes, no crawling along the row, and no spending an evening recovering from an afternoon of tying plants. That panel has now been in my garden for 15 years. It has a little surface rust, but the structure is still doing its job. $25 spread across 15 seasons comes to less than $2 a year. Compare that with replacing wooden stakes every season, and the math became very simple for me. But the cattle panel solved only half of my problem. I still had to get the tomatoes into the ground, and that was where I discovered my second big mistake. I used to believe that tomatoes needed deep planting holes, so I would dig holes 8, 10, sometimes 12 inches deep. The deeper the roots, I thought, the stronger the plant. Unfortunately, my back had a very different opinion. After digging several holes in my heavy soil, I could feel the strain building. Then one morning, while removing an old tomato plant, I looked carefully at the roots. Most of them weren't reaching straight down. They were spreading through the upper layer of loose, oxygen-rich soil that made me stop and rethink the whole process. If the tomato could develop roots along its buried stem, why was I digging a deep hole for the entire plant? So I began using a shallow trench instead, about 3 inches deep, only deep enough to hold the lower part of the stem. I removed the lowest leaves from a young tomato plant, Lay the bare section of stem gently along the trench and leave the growing tip pointing upward. Tomatoes are unusually good at forming additional roots from buried stem tissue. So instead of forcing the whole root system into one deep hole, I'm giving the plant another opportunity to develop roots along that horizontal section of stem. And the best part, I can make that planting trench with a small hand trowel. Sometimes when the soil is soft enough, I can make it with my fingers. That is a very different experience from digging a deep hole over and over again. I also add a small amount of finished worm castings to the planting area. Not because I believe worm castings are a miracle cure. I use them because they're a useful source of organic matter and nutrients, and because well-made castings can contribute beneficial microbial life to the soil. I don't need a bucketful. A small handful is enough for the way I garden. Then I lay the tomato gently into the shallow trench, cover the buried stem with soil, leave the growing tip exposed, and water it thoroughly. That's it. No deep hole. No heavy digging. No need to wrestle with the soil for every plant. And this was the beginning of another lesson I learned the hard way. My garden didn't need me to work harder. It needed me to stop making unnecessary work for myself. That realization eventually changed the way I treated the soil, too. I used to turn the beds over every spring. I would take a hoe or shovel and break everything apart, because I thought a perfectly loose, bare bed meant I was taking good care of the garden. But every season I was disturbing the soil structure I had spent the previous season building. So I stopped treating the soil like something that needed to be rebuilt from scratch every spring. Instead, I began protecting it. And that is where straw mulch became one of the most useful tools in my garden. I spread it in layers around the tomato plants, keeping a small gap around each stem. The mulch helps shade the soil surface, slow evaporation, moderate temperature swings, and suppress many weeds. It doesn't do everything, but it means I don't have to water as often, and I don't spend nearly as much time fighting weeds. For me, that difference matters more every year, because when you're 60, 70, or older, the best gardening method isn't necessarily the one that produces the biggest plant. It's the one that lets you come back tomorrow without paying for today's work with your back. I also stopped buying bags of decorative mulch from the garden center. A bale of straw from a nearby farm costs me around $8 and can last through much of the season. That may not sound like a huge saving, but when you're gardening year after year, small savings become surprisingly large. And the biggest savings aren't always on the receipt. They're in the hours of work you don't have to do. There was another change I made that saved my hands almost as much effort as the cattle panel saved my back. I stopped using plastic ties. I used to buy those little green and yellow plant ties because they were cheap and convenient. But as the tomato stems grew, some ties became tight around the plants. And at the end of the season, I had a pile of little pieces of plastic to remove and throw away. So I started cutting strips from old cotton t-shirts, about 1 inch wide and 12 inches long. The fabric is soft, flexible, and gentle on growing stems. I use it wherever a plant needs a little extra support. But with the cattle panel, I don't need to tie every plant individually. That's another reason I like the arch. The structure does most of the holding. I simply guide the plants through the openings as they grow. For longer rows, I sometimes use jute twine in a simple weave. I stand on one side of the arch and pass the twine in front of one plant, behind the next, then in front of the next. The plants end up supported between the strands instead of being tied tightly to individual stems. And because the working height is around my waist and chest, I can do the whole row without spending an afternoon bent over. That small change made gardening feel less like a physical test. One morning, my grandson came running into the garden while I was doing this. He looked at me weaving the twine between the tomato plants and asked, "Grandpa, what are you doing?" I told him, "I'm dancing with the tomatoes." He laughed. Then he grabbed a strip of cloth and started helping me. That little moment stayed with me. Because somewhere along the way, the garden had stopped being a place where I went to finish chores. It had become a place where I wanted to spend time. And then my grandson taught me another lesson. One morning, he called me over to look at something on a tomato leaf. He had found a large green hornworm. It was almost as thick as my thumb and slowly chewing its way through the plant. Years ago, I would have reached for a spray bottle immediately, but after years of watching the garden change, I looked a little closer first. There were small white structures attached to the caterpillar. Those were the cocoons of parasitic wasps that had developed from larvae inside the hornworm. The wasps had already completed much of their work, and that meant something important. I didn't need to treat every insect I saw as an enemy. I left the hornworm alone. My grandson watched closely. He had started the morning thinking he had found a dangerous garden pest. Instead, he was watching one part of the garden's natural pest control system at work. That doesn't mean I never manage pests. It means I don't automatically reach for a spray bottle before I understand what I'm looking at. And that principle became especially important around my tomato flowers. Tomatoes can self-pollinate, but bumblebees can help release pollen through a behavior called buzz pollination. So I don't spray the flowers casually. I'd rather have the bees visiting than create another problem I have to solve later. Over time, the garden began to sound different. There was the hum of bumblebees around the flowers. Birds moved through the trees. Ladybugs and predatory insects appeared among the leaves. And under the mulch, the soil stayed cooler and more protected from the harsh afternoon sun. The garden was becoming less dependent on me doing something every minute. That was the real goal. Not a garden that required absolutely no work, a garden that required less unnecessary work. There is a difference. On the hottest summer afternoons, when the temperature outside climbs into the mid-30s Celsius, the tomato arch gives me a shaded place to stand. I keep a wooden chair underneath it. Sometimes my cat, Mun, curls up nearby. Sometimes my grandson sits in the shade and asks which tomato is ready. And I can stand there without feeling that my body is paying a price simply for being in the garden. One afternoon, I handed him a ripe sun gold. He bit into it, looked at me, and laughed with tomato juice running down his chin. I remember thinking that this was the harvest I cared about most. Not just the tomatoes, the fact that I could still be there to share them. That is why I no longer think of my garden as a place where I have to prove how much work I can endure. I think of it as a place I have designed to age with me. The first year wasn't perfect. There were chewed leaves. Birds took a few fruits. Some plants needed more support than I expected. but I learned to stop treating every imperfection as an emergency. A garden is an ecosystem, not a machine. Beneficial insects may take time to establish. Birds may take time to discover the food and shelter available to them. And sometimes the best thing I can do is observe before I interfere. That doesn't mean ignoring serious pest problems. It means choosing the least disruptive solution that works. Once I understood that, gardening became much quieter. I wasn't constantly digging. I wasn't constantly tying. I wasn't constantly spraying. I was observing, guiding, harvesting, and enjoying the garden. That is what the cattle panel, the shallow planting, the mulch, and the simple support system gave me. Not a perfect garden, a more sustainable way for me to keep gardening as I grow older. And there is one more thing I haven't explained yet. If you watch closely, you may have noticed the dark material I sometimes add around the base of my tomatoes. It isn't ordinary barbecue charcoal. It's biochar that I've been experimenting with in my garden for years. I use it as part of a broader soil building system, and there is a reason I don't simply scatter raw charcoal everywhere and expect miracles. What I learned about charging biochar before using it changed the way I think about this material. But that is another story, and it deserves its own morning in the garden. I used to think getting older meant giving up the parts of gardening I loved. Now I know it means changing the way I garden. I don't dig deep holes because I no longer need to. I don't drive rows of wooden stakes because one strong arch can support an entire row. I don't kneel beside every plant to tie it because I built the support system around the height of my body. And I don't try to control every insect because I've learned that some of them are already doing a job I used to do myself. The biggest change wasn't the cattle panel. It wasn't the mulch. It wasn't even the way I plant the tomato. It was realizing that I didn't have to fight the garden to make it productive. I could design the garden so that it worked with me. That idea has saved me more than money. It has saved me time. It has saved me unnecessary bending and kneeling. And most importantly, it allowed me to keep doing something I thought I might have to give up: gardening. So if your body has started telling you that the old way isn't working anymore, don't assume the answer is to stop. Maybe the answer is to change the garden. Raise the work to a comfortable height. Reduce the digging. Cover the soil. Use structures that do more of the supporting for you. And give yourself permission to leave some things imperfect. A garden doesn't have to look like a farm to feed you. It doesn't have to be perfectly weed-free to be healthy. And you don't have to exhaust yourself to deserve the harvest. Sometimes the smartest tool in an older gardener's shed isn't a stronger shovel. It's a better design. And there is still one piece of my garden I haven't shown you. That dark material beneath the tomatoes. The biochar. I've been using it for years. But the interesting part isn't simply what biochar is. It's what happens when you prepare it before putting it into the soil, and why I stopped treating it like an ordinary soil amendment. That's the story I'll tell you next. For now, I'm going to sit beneath this tomato arch, drink my tea, and wait for the next ripe sun gold. Because after all these years, I finally learned something simple. The goal isn't to make the gardener work harder for the garden. The goal is to make the garden give something back to the gardener. And that is a garden I can grow old